A nun and a dying priest, so close their breaths almost touch. In the dim Truch light, it feels like the air itself is daring them to cross the line, to confess something deeper than vows ever allowed. And then comes his shocking request. He doesn't want to be buried whole. He wants his right hand cut away because inside it is a secret key that could unravel lives, expose hidden sins, and ignite a storm the church itself fears. Stay right here, because what Sister Miriam does next will leave you questioning faith, loyalty, and even love. Before we dive in, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling us from which country you're watching this story unfold. We want to see how far this mystery reaches.
The call came just after midnight, when the convent's corridors were most honest with their creaks. Sister Miriam lay awake with her hands folded over the blanket, watching a stray square of moonlight tremble on her ceiling. She had not truly slept in 3 days. Not since the news about Father Luca's collapse had reached them with the urgency of an ambulance siren and the cold silence of a last rite. It was predictable, she supposed. The old priest had been a storm contained by bone for a decade, coughing like broken bells, eyes always scanning corners as if someone waited there. But if death was predictable, the timing still felt like betrayal. The phone's ring stung the quiet, and Miriam slid from her bed, feet finding the slippers with the instinct of habit, heartbeat sinking to the second ring. On the other end, the hospital night nurse spoke efficiently. "He's asking for you specifically, sister. He says it cannot wait until morning." Miriam thanked her with a voice steadier than her years, lifted her rosary, and crossed herself without thinking. She told herself the usual lie of duty, that she was calm, that she knew how to leave clean footprints through a dirty crisis, and then stepped into the dark. She'd first met Father Luca 15 years earlier, in the winter that iced the gutters and knives and made the cathedral's gargoyles look like they were exhaling smoke. He'd arrived as a temporary confessor and stayed as a permanent problem solver, the sort of priest who smelled like old paper and clove cigarettes and made jokes too learned to be entirely wholesome. He had been kind to the novices and blunt with the bishops, which made him a rumor long before he became a legend. There were whispers of time spent in places where church bells were replaced by sirens, detention centers, police basements, orphanages that were more warehouse than home. He never confirmed, never denied. He had that talent for speaking in a way that sounded like confession and turned out to be merely beautiful evasion. Miriam had admired him, then distrusted that admiration, then settled into the uneasy respect you reserve for people who carry more keys than doors. The hospital waiting room smelled like wet wool and antiseptic. Fluorescent lights flattened the faces of night shift workers into masks. When Miriam reached his bed, she was struck by how small he looked. The oxygen cannula made him look tethered to something invisible. The heart monitor translated him into a hesitant metronome. He turned his head, and his eyes, though sunk in bruised crescents, were exactly as she remembered, alert to a fault. "You came," he rasped, a small smile cutting a new wrinkle between two old ones. "Of course," she said. "You asked." He let out a short laugh that was almost a cough. "I'm going to ask for more. It will be a sin to you if you refuse, and a sin to me if you accept. That's how you know it's real." She didn't sit. Standing kept the blood honest. "Say it," she told him, and braced herself against the foot of the bed. He asked her to close the curtain and turn off the bedside TV. She did. He asked for her phone. She powered it down and placed it face down on the tray. The old paranoia again, she thought, but she honored it. He pressed 2 fingertips to the inside of her wrist, as if confirming that she had a pulse and therefore a conscience. Then he said, "I want to be buried without my right hand." His voice wasn't theatrical or apologetic. It was a request as simple as "open the window." For a moment, Miriam thought he was delirious. She waited for the priestly grin that turned macabre into metaphor. None came. "You're serious," she said. The heart monitor answered for him with a dry beep. "Why?" she asked, and he smiled like a man in pain who has been asked to prove it. "Because," he said softly, "I took an oath with that hand that God never recognized. It has to end in the ground separate from the rest of me, or not at all. And there's something sewn into the palm you'll need." "A key," he swallowed. The oxygen hissed like a snake. "Not a key like in fairy tales, sister. A key to a locker, in a station you wouldn't visit unless you needed to be someone else. What's inside that locker will undo a lie old enough to have grown moss. It will save a life that should never have been discarded, and it will kill a reputation that deserves no monument. I cannot tell you more, not out loud. There are people who are very patient listeners." Miriam felt a tired, bitter amusement ripple through her. Catholicism loved its boxes inside boxes. "You think there are ears?" she asked, glancing at the ceiling vent. He smiled only with his eyes now, the way cautious men do. "I know there are. You will find a man in a blue windbreaker who claims to be a courier. Do not trust him. You will find a nun older than God who will tell you this is not your business. Trust her once. You will find a child who knows too much. You must not tell the child who you are." He closed his eyes to breathe, and when he opened them again, they had lost none of their focus. "Do this for me, and I will die less foolish. Do not, and you will survive longer, but something will rot in the walls." The outrage, when it came, was old-fashioned and strong. "Father, I cannot mutilate the dead. That isn't a request, it's a grotesque. There are sacraments. There are laws," he nodded. "The canon law says no. The God I met in cells and back rooms says yes." The heart monitor ticked like a bomb in a lazy movie. She let silence do its arithmetic. Something about his insistence, the specific detail of a hand and a palm and a key, sketched the outline of a labyrinth. Miriam had walked enough corridors of institutions to know when the walls were fake. "You will die tonight?" she asked without softness. His smile was apology and permission. "Before dawn, if the quarreling in my chest picks a winner." She stepped closer and finally sat. The vinyl chair sighed. "If I agreed," she said, "there would be logistics. The mortuary, the sisters, the bishop." He shook his head, a small, stubborn child of a gesture. "There would be you. I arranged certain papers." He nodded at the side table. "Envelope under the Bible. It's a release form and an authorization that will pass scrutiny for 24 hours. It will not pass the second day. All you need to do is be brave enough for one sunrise." He let his hand find the edge of the sheet and made a tiny pulling motion, as if he could uncover himself by will. "Sister Miriam, I am not your superior. I am a tired old liar. But I am telling you the truth now. Do this because the church you love is realer when we cut away the parts of it that pretend to be bone and are only wax." She should have said no. She should have stood with her spine like a staff and left him to reconcile with his own ghosts. But in the end, Miriam was not humble because she lacked ego. She was humble because she knew what ego owed. She thought of the girls she'd shepherded out of houses with broken crockery and the boys whose fists came unclenched when given a broom. She thought of secrets kept in the name of decorum that tracked mud across generations. She thought of the last time she had said yes to something that frightened her and how it had turned out both worse and better than she'd feared. She reached for the Bible, found the yellowed envelope, and slid it into her sleeve. "I will open your hand," she whispered, and he laughed, an exhausted, grateful sound that seemed to come from the monitor more than from him. "It's not mine anymore," he said. "That makes it easier." He died at 4:19 a.m. The nurse came in with a clipboard and a face trained to be soft and practical. She confirmed, she documented, she touched the sheet. Miriam watched it happen like a scene from a film she'd already seen in a dream, unreal and inevitable. Forms were signed. Phones were called. A gurney squeaked like an old violin. The envelope gained weight. Outside, the night was unhooking itself from the horizon, and the first recklessness of morning was slipping into the city's arteries. Miriam followed the body to the hospital's basement, and then to the mortuary where everything smelled like steel that wanted to be clean and never would be. It should have been impossible, but the envelope said otherwise. She presented the authorization. The man behind the counter read it with the devotion of a bureaucrat, noticing nothing but stamps. A small sum changed hands for the special handling, papers. Transformed sacrilege into service. She dressed the body, herself, because that's what she knew how to do when her mind needed a task and her soul needed a dare. The mortician had stepped out for cigarettes or air. Both kinds might kill you. Both kinds might save you for a few minutes. Alone under a humming fluorescent strip, she peeled back the sheet to the shoulders, untied the cords at the back of the hospital gown, and spoke a prayer under her breath that God could file under miscellaneous acts of courage. The right hand lay on his chest like a pale bird. She couldn't stop noticing how ordinary it looked. You imagine the hands of the dead will look like sculpture, serene, beautiful, carved into meaning by the light. Instead, this one had a hangnail, a bruise at the base of the thumb, a faint ink stain that no ritual had scrubbed. She felt a wild anger, at him for asking, at herself for agreeing, at the world for wanting the kind of salvation that demanded a knife. She did not bring a knife. She wasn't a thief in a movie. She brought a small, sterile scalpel borrowed from a nurse who didn't ask why, as well as a roll of surgical gauze and a needle with thick thread. She had imagined she might faint. Instead, she was the calmest person she'd ever been. The cut started at the wrist. The blood had given up its claim hours earlier, so what came was a slow, dark weeping that reminded her of certain old ceilings after rain. She worked like a tailor. She was terrible at it, then better than clinical. When she lifted the hand free, it felt indecently light. She wrapped it in gauze with a tenderness that embarrassed her and slipped it into the canvas bag she'd brought for books. She sewed the stump shut as neatly as she could manage, crossing herself after the last knot. No thunder. No voice from a vent saying, "Stop." Only the sound of the fluorescent light, judging nothing. She thought that would be the worst of it. She was wrong. As she cleaned and rearranged and made him presentable for whoever would see him next, she pressed her fingers into his palm through the gauze, feeling for the promised thing. Beneath the padding of dead flesh, something rigid lengthwise, no bigger than a house key, was indeed sewn in. She could feel the line of thread. Whoever had done it had been either a surgeon or a careful sinner. It took her only a moment, half by instinct and half by horror, to realize what that implied. He had done this to himself while still alive, or convinced some accomplice to do it, and had carried the knowledge like a splinter close to the bone. She whispered, "You idiot," without anger, and then, because tenderness persisted despite disgust, "Thank you." She placed her hand against his forehead the way she would with a fevered child, closed his eyes properly and covered him up to the chin. She left a prayer in the air, not for forgiveness, but for accuracy. The city outside had traded its insomniac lights for bakeries and buses. She tucked the canvas bag into the passenger footwell, ran a shake of sanitizer over her fingers as if it would rinse the request from them, and drove. Even after she had left the hospital behind, her eyes kept skipping to the rearview mirror. "A blue windbreaker," he had said. "Do not trust." At the second stoplight, a man jogged across the crosswalk with that purposeful, stiff-shouldered gait that made her think of federal agents in television shows who always seemed surprised by their own choices. He wasn't coming for her. Not yet. But paranoia is a rehearsal, and she had always believed in practice. She didn't go to the convent. Father Luca's instructions had been precise about that much. "Between the place where the trains leave and the place where the trains are forgotten," he'd said, and she'd instantly pictured the old intercity depot that had been modernized up top and left 19th century down below. She parked 3 blocks away and went in on foot, the canvas bag laced shut with a cross knot that could have tied a sail. The station at this hour was a collage of faces with luggage and faces that were luggage. She walked like a woman who knew where she was going. That was half the trick to not being questioned. The other half was looking like someone whose questioners had already failed. She took the stairs down to the older concourse, all yellowed tiles and ghost advertisements, and crossed to the banks of lockers that had somehow survived the latest modernization fad. She hadn't yet cut open the gauze. The thing in the palm might be a joke, a decoy. He had never been a simple man. She couldn't expect a simple errand. There, in the shade of a dead clock, she slid into an alcove and unwrapped the gauze just enough to find the stitches. The scalpel made quiet work of it. She parted the palm as carefully as if she were looking for a lost blessing and found a narrow metal cylinder, dull with oil, clipped flush into the seam of the lifeline. Not a key, then. A small capsule. She bit her lip until she tasted copper, pressed the cap, and it clicked open with the weary elegance of old mechanisms. Inside lay a scrap of paper rolled tight as a Venus worm and a sliver of metal etched with a number. She recognized the style. A cut-down locker key like the ones used decades ago when lockers were meant to be opened by memory and not phones. The scrap of paper had a single line of tidy block letters. Lower Docks, St. Venera School, 2's Midnight, ask for glass. She didn't allow herself the luxury of deciphering intent. She closed the capsule, resealed the gauze, and retied the canvas bag. Then she stood very still and listened. To her right, a man in a blue windbreaker leaned against a column pretending it took this much thought to drink coffee. He wasn't tall. He had that carefully casual posture that consultants learn at airports. He was not watching her. He was watching the lockers, which meant he was watching whoever watched the lockers. She realized with a clean, cold certainty that Father Luca had not been paranoid. He had been late. They were already here. She did not run. She walked to the other end of the locker corridor, studied the map she had no need to study, and timed her breath. She waited for a family with 3 rolling suitcases to create a hallway of noise and then slid behind them, moving with their clumsy tide, and turned not toward the exit, but toward the utility corridor where a faded sign promised platform access that hadn't existed since the year cameras were black boxes. The door required a maintenance badge. The door also respected a firm shove and an older nun who looked like she had spent her youth moving furniture no man could lift. It opened. She slipped into the dust. In the concrete dimness, away from the hum of public civility, she allowed herself a quicker pace. The corridor ran to a dead end and a ladder bolted to the wall. She climbed, the canvas bag knocking her calf, and emerged into a fenced-off portion of the platform where pigeons practiced bureaucracy. Through the chain link, she could see the blue windbreaker now, 50 yards off, speaking into his collar, no longer pretending to be a civilian. He raised his head and looked directly at her through the fence. They both had the same thought. It would be too obvious to pursue. It would be too obvious to flee. He smiled like someone with legal papers in his pocket that allowed him to smile. He gestured that she should wait. She gestured that he should pray. Then she ducked behind a column, cut through the derelict stairwell, and was back out on the street with the bag and an acceleration she hadn't felt since her rebel lungs were 22. For the first time since the hospital, Miriam allowed fear to philosophize. Who were they? Why ask for glass? Why a school? St. Venera had closed 2 years ago after a funding scandal and a plumbing disaster. Old Parents still used its parking lot as a shortcut to the river. It sat near the lower docks where barges moored and dreams ran silent under tarps. Midnight on Tuesday was 36 hours away. In that time, 1,000 stories could die. She drove aimlessly for half an hour, then chose to be decisive. She would go to a place where the dead had once been edited, and see whether any editors were still alive. The archive lived in the basement of the diocesan office where filing cabinets went when they wanted to pretend they were monasteries. This was where Father Luca had always said you could find an answer if you were willing to lose a week of your life and a fingertip to a drawer. There was a key to it on his ring that the sacristan had never managed to take away. Miriam had borrowed that key once, returned it with a homily about trust, and memorized the bite pattern with a glance that lasted too long. Now, at midday, she walked in through the front like someone who belonged and descended the back stairs like someone who would no longer ask permission. In the archive, cool, slightly damp, smelling of dust that had been blessed by boredom, she found the shelf reserved for St. Venera, and there, a mismatched binder with an elastic band for a spine. It wasn't even hidden. That felt like insolence. Inside, enrollment ledgers, fundraising letters, photographs of smiling children with hands folded in front of blotchy walls, and a slim folder labeled Directives Glass 2003-2005. She slid the folder out as gently as a secret and found a series of memos written in the flat, choking voice of institutional mercy. Pilot program for placement of difficult cases. Curation of intake, unaccompanied youth. Coordination with external benefactors. The word that repeated was curation, as if children were paintings in a gallery, and someone had to select which ones deserved proper lighting. At the bottom, clipped to a form with a rusted staple, a list of initials and the note, "Glass to approve transfers." The destination column was blacked out in thick marker. On the back, a single handwritten line, "Do not permit any case to develop a paper trail beyond first alias." Glass was not a window. Glass was a person. She took the folder to a corner table and read quickly, hands flat, the canvas bag against her shin. There were hints of money, of promises to donors who preferred quiet philanthropy, of relocation opportunities that smelled faintly of transport and more strongly of disappearance. A paragraph in a letterhead from a charitable foundation contained the only trace of actual generosity. "We continue to emphasize counseling and family reunification." And then a handwritten scrawl slicing through, "No reunification for flagged cases." She didn't know she was crying until a tear lifted a smear of marker into a gray archipelago. She closed the folder like a lid on a bruised fruit. "You," she addressed the air that smelled like old cardboard, "were never paranoid. You were late." In the corridor upstairs, she passed a nun whose bun was a crown of white wire. The woman had a gaze like a surveyor's pole, exacting, vertical. She had been at St. Venera when it bloomed and when it rotted. They called her Sister Osanna, and they said she had outlived 2 orders, 3 administrations, and a war in which no one was supposed to admit they had taken sides. "Miriam," Osana said without greeting, her voice hoarse with disuse or disdain, "you look as if you've opened a jar that said, 'Do not open.'" Miriam, who usually bowed to her elders with the grace of a student receiving a ruler tap, didn't bend. "Did you work with a person called Glass?" she asked. Osana's mouth curled in a humorless smile. "Glass was not a person," she said. "Glass was a mirror. Men looked into it and saw who they wanted to be. It belonged to the diocese. It belonged to no one. The program nearly burned us. We closed the school instead and called it a victory." She started to move past, then stopped, eyes landing on the canvas bag like a hawk's on a field mouse. "He finally died, didn't he?" she asked. Miriam nodded. "Did he send you to the docks?" Osana's smile cut deeper. "Then you will need salt and courage. Salt you can buy. Courage you must steal. Should I refuse?" Miriam asked, hating the tremor in the question. Osana searched her face with the intimacy of a confession and the cruelty of triage. "Refuse if you wish to keep your name polished and your conscience useful," she said. "Except if you wish to be accurate. The church is not a museum of saints. It is a hospital for liars. He was one. So am I, so are you. He asked you because you still believe something can be salvaged without power." She leaned in so the hallway lights volleyed off her glasses. "You will be offered a chance to give the key to someone who calls himself a courier. He will say he is protecting children. He is not. He is protecting memory from itself. Do not give it to him. Also, if a child recognizes you, that will be the end of this in the worst way. Hide your face with kindness." She slipped a small battered tin into Miriam's palm. "Salt," she said. "Keep it dry. You will know when." Miriam left with the folder's images in her mouth like rust. She spent the next day arranging lies that looked like substitutes for truth, telling the Mother Superior she'd be away for a retreat, telling the sacristan she'd left her keys at the hospital, telling herself that the line between obedience and survival is a thread any wind can pluck. She ate once and tasted nothing. She slept not at all. In the late afternoon, she drove to the lower docks and watched barges slide by like small countries. The St. Venera building hunched at the water's edge, a failed promise with ivy. Its windows were boarded on the lower level and rhetorically intact above. A chain-link fence promised to keep out thieves who could read. She parked around the corner and waited as dusk unrolled its indifferent theater. Midnight drew a thin line across the sky and then a thicker one across the water. The air smelled of diesel, rope, and something faintly sugary, as if candy had been cooked here once and never forgiven. A single light glowed above the side entrance to St. Venera, a faint halo around a door that used to welcome late parents and now welcomed only brave fools. Miriam walked like a woman who had to practice not being followed. Inside, the corridor collected her footsteps and multiplied them. She reached the old gym where school banners still pretended there had been championships. The whispered sound of someone moving was not a ghost. "Sister?" a voice said, careful and young. "You're early." He was maybe 18, or maybe the sort of 13 that knows how to counterfeit 5 years. He wore a hoodie that defied weather, and a gaze that had learned to never ask for anything it couldn't steal. He looked at her hands, not her face. "You've got something," he said. She tried to make her voice uninteresting. "I'm looking for Glass." He did not flinch. "Then you're later than you think." He tilted his head toward the back bleachers. A woman was sitting there older than God, Osana had said, and she wore her age like armor. It was not Osana. It was someone else entirely, a nun with cheekbones like warnings and eyes that had cataloged sins by category. "You should not be here," she told Miriam without anger. "He should not have sent you. But he loved you because you still say yes." She pushed herself to her feet with a sound that signaled both arthritis and stubbornness. "Call me Sister Agatha. Call me wrong if it helps. The boy is called John. He is the only one who can walk through that door. Without the door remembering him tomorrow," Sister Agatha indicated. A steel door at the back of the gym that was new enough to be innocent and old enough to be interesting. The boy, John, fished out a plastic card and a bobby pin and performed a small miracle of pragmatism. The lock clicked open like a secret deciding to confess because it was bored. Inside, a room with metal shelving, an ancient copier, a desk that had been expensive when Nixon resigned, and a locker bank whose paint bore the fingerprints of people who had never expected to be caught. Agatha nodded at the canvas bag. "The hand," she said softly. "He finally cut it loose." Miriam flinched, and Agatha's smile acknowledged the flinch as a form of prayer. It was never just a hand, Agatha went on. It was a ledger that fit inside a man. Do you have the capsule? Miriam pulled it free. Agatha's eyes did not move. Well done. Now you will need to be very stupid or very holy to keep it. The door behind them opened with brisk impoliteness. A man in a blue windbreaker stepped in as if he had rented the room for the night. He held no weapon. He held a file folder like a warrant. Sisters, he said with a politeness at odds with everything about him, thank you for coming. I'm glad we can do this without melodrama. I'm called Daniel, and I'm here on behalf of a task force that works very hard to clean up messes left by idealists with scissors. We're here to protect children. Give me the capsule and we can make sure the last of the glass files are destroyed responsibly. He smiled like a man who believed in recycling. Who do you report to? Miriam asked, stalling for the time it takes a brain to choose courage instead of cleverness. To a commission, Daniel said. An interfaith interagency coalition convened after the difficulties. His euphemism smelled like money that had been sprayed with air freshener. Sister Agatha laughed, a small cutting sound that reminded Miriam of spoons on bone china. You report to men who want to ensure the story ends in a neat paragraph, Agatha said. We report to a God who never learned to love neat paragraphs. Daniel sighed as if someone had overcooked the rice. Please, the longer this goes, the worse it becomes. There are names, sister. Some of them very powerful. Some of them already dead, which complicates things, or haven't you noticed? He turned those TV agent eyes on Miriam. You are a woman of conscience. Use it, give me the capsule. You don't have to be brave. You have to be realistic. The boy John took a step forward, hands loose, body angled like someone who had learned to fight in rooms without adults. Daniel's gaze flicked to him in a way, already calculating the paperwork. I will not repeat myself, he said. The capsule, now. Miriam did what she always did when a man with authority mistook firmness for compliance. She asked a question as a sacrament. What happens to the children, she said, who were curated into nowhere? Daniel gave the bureaucrat's honest answer. They became someone else. And the records? She asked. Curated, he said, and something in his eyes admitted that he hated the word but would keep it anyway. She did not give him the capsule. Instead, she reached into the bag, pulled out the gauze-wrapped hand, and cradled it in both arms like an obscene relic. Daniel's face rearranged itself without moving. Sister, he said gently, don't make this about symbols. We have work to do. Sister Agatha moved first. She stepped close enough to Daniel that he had to choose between moving back and becoming complicit. He chose the coward's bravado of stillness. Agatha slipped the battered tin of salt into Miriam's palm without looking. Salt, Osana had said. You will know when, Miriam did. She opened the tin, pressed salt into the gauze until it clung like frost, and then, without quite understanding why, she brought the hand to the steel door's keypad. The salt stung her knuckles. She pressed the gauze-wrapped palm against the numbers and felt a faint click, like a tongue finding a word. There was a hum, a mechanical swallow. The locker bank unlocked not one door but all of them in a slow, hypnotic sequence, as if someone were running a finger along the back of a xylophone. Daniel reached for his radio. John was faster. He swept Daniel's wrist aside with a movement that was both graceful and rude. Sister Agatha's hand landed on Daniel's shoulder with a pressure that reminded him of his grandmother and also of weightlifting. The doors hung open like startled mouths. Inside, not money, not discs, but envelopes, each with a name and a date and a photograph. Some photographs were of children with faces blurred by time. Some were of men in suits pretending to be furniture. Glass, it seemed, had been a collector. The salt had been the trick, the oldest housewife's secret applied to the newest kind of safe. Salt in the codes, salt in the seams. Daniel looked like a man watching a chessboard he thought he'd memorized sprout an extra row. You cannot take those, he said, and this time the plea was genuine. You will make chaos that will not help anyone you think you are helping. Miriam met his eyes and found, to her surprise, something human there. Fatigue? A longing for the version of himself that had believed in clean solutions. Chaos is the only honest thing left, she said. She took one envelope at random. The name was an alias. The photograph was a boy she knew. She felt the floor of the gym shift under the weight of something that had been true all along and now had a label. She took another envelope and another. John had already started stuffing them into his hoodie. Sister Agatha moved like a librarian who decided to save the banned books from a fire. The alarm they expected never sounded. Instead, a bell somewhere in the building rang twice like a polite dinner summons. It was a signal, apparently, and the blue windbreaker men arrived in twos, silent, expressions stapled on. They did not draw guns. They stood in the doorway like parentheses, intending to contain. "Enough," said a new voice from behind them, and in walked Bishop Renard, the kind of prelate who had never learned to walk without a red carpet under his feet. His face wore the expression of a man who had come to negotiate and had found instead a grammar lesson. "Sister Miriam," he said mildly, "I had hoped we might discuss this without props." Bishop Renard had been a rumor in Miriam's life since she was a novice. Charitable, charismatic, a collector of donors, an enemy of scandals. He embraced children with the exact right pressure and spoke about the poor with a glint that suggested he found poverty intriguing. Seeing him here in the gym of a dead school made something in Miriam's stomach turn to braille. "Your Excellency," she said, and did not bow. He took in the open lockers with a glance that dated him. "This should have been cleared," he murmured, to no one and to everyone. "We had an understanding." Daniel was pale now, the pallor of a man whose orders had suddenly become suggestions. "We're attempting to," he began, and the bishop cut him off with a tastefully raised hand. "Please, the adults will address this. Glass?" Miriam asked. Bishop Renard smiled a smile that could bless a check. "Glass was an attempt," he said. "An attempt to do something that governments were failing to do, that families were failing to do, that charity alone could not. An attempt to curate futures rather than waiting for them to curate themselves through disaster. We failed, as attempts do, but some futures were saved." He gestured to the open envelopes like a magician revealing a pigeon. "And some risks must be contained." "What did you curate them into?" Miriam asked. He had the grace not to smile again. "Lives," he said softly. "Some true, some tolerable. We filtered out those who would have drowned and gave them boats." Sister Agatha's laugh was genuinely delighted now, the way laughter can be when it recognizes a lie that has been cleaned so well, even its mother doesn't know it. "You gave some of them anchors," she said, "and called it salvation." There is a moment in every argument when truth arrives like a drunk guest and knocks something important off the table. It is not persuasive. It is not polite. It simply insists. In that moment, the gym changed shape for Miriam. She saw not a bishop and an agent and a boy and two nuns. She saw a stage upon which choice would be dressed as compromise if she let it. She felt the capsule in her palm, its tiny weight and engine. She remembered Father Luca's hand on hers, his voice that smelled like clove and old books saying, "Do this because the church is realer when we cut away the wax." "Here is what will happen," Bishop Renard said in the tone of someone explaining a recipe to a child. "You will give the capsule to Mr. Daniel. He will ensure that what can be salvaged is salvaged, and what can be destroyed is destroyed. You will leave with the consolation that you have served the truth without indulging chaos. We will make a statement about the historic hardships of administrative transitions. We will fund a scholarship. We will feed the press a story about old mistakes and new standards. And then, sister, you will sleep." He folded his hands in pastoral geometry. "You are tired." "I am tired," Miriam agreed. "But I have never slept better than when I chose not to be managed." She passed the capsule to Sister Agatha. The bishop's eyebrows rose 1 careful millimeter. "Be serious," he said. Agatha was. She walked to the ancient copier, lifted the lid, and looked at Miriam. "Turn it on," she said. Miriam did, and the machine whirred awake like a bear coming out of a coma. Agatha placed the capsule on the glass and pressed start. Daniel made a sound of exasperation that would have been a laugh in a better year. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Making a paper trail," Agatha said. And when the first copy slid out, ghostly and perfect, she placed it into an envelope marked with a name Miriam recognized from a parish bulletin. Someone of power. Someone who had donated pews. Someone who would prefer to be remembered as furniture. She fed another name and another. The copier chugged like an old hymn. The gym filled with accumulations of paper that had weight, even if it had no legality. The bishop did not lunge. He did not shout. He merely stepped forward and said very softly, "Sister Agatha, you will stop." She did not. John had begun to film, not with a flourish, but with the quiet expertise of a child whose survival had depended on documenting adults' errors. Daniel noticed and made a calculation. He stepped back out of frame and pretended it had been his idea. The blue windbreaker men looked at one another and did nothing, because men in blue windbreakers are trained to do nothing until someone with a title tells them to do something, and the man with the title was busy wishing he had learned to run a different kind of church. When the copier jammed, as all copiers do when they sense drama, Sister Agatha swore with the elegance of a woman who had taught literature. Miriam reached to clear the jam and found a photograph stuck in the rollers. She tugged it free and froze. The boy in the photograph was not a stranger. He was Father Luca, 20, maybe 22, hair like a rebellion, eyes like a promise. He stood beside a girl whose face had been carefully scratched out with a pin. On the back, in handwriting that did not know it would be archived, 3 words: "Our vow holds." The date was 38 years ago. Something in Miriam's breath learned to walk again. She tucked the photograph into her sleeve before her sense of decency could vote. She cleared the jam. The machine resumed its liturgy. Bishop Renard watched her with curiosity sharpened by threat. "He wanted to be buried without his hand," the bishop said musingly, as if testing the sentence for taste. How like him. A theater man to the end. He was always too charmed by gestures. Miriam, who had loved him and disliked him in equal measure, felt a heat she didn't trust rising up her throat. His gestures were the only honest part left, she said. Renard shook his head. No, his guilt was, and I do not fault him for it. Guilt is the one sacrament the world has not yet learned to monetize. You, he added, eyes half kind, are about to give away your usefulness. That will be a shame. You could have done more good working with us. The offer sat there like a poisoned fruit in a still life. John stopped recording and stepped between them. He was small. He was loud without speaking. He opened one of the envelopes at random, pulled out a page, and read the line that mattered. No reunification for flagged cases. He held it up to the bishop like a mirror and said, in a voice that belonged to all the children who had ever been curated into silence, "How many?" The question burned the room like incense that chokes. Renard looked at him, and in that look there was something almost pastoral, almost kind, almost what people meant when they said, "Father." Enough, the bishop said. Enough to make it complicated. Enough to make the clean version of this story a lie. He looked back at Miriam. Sister, end this. We will all be grateful later. She did not. She turned instead to Daniel. You, she said, and her voice found a new register she hadn't known she possessed. Do you know what you are for? Daniel's answer came from the weary part of him that had wanted a vocation and had gotten a job. For stopping worse things from happening, he said. For containing the heat so the house does not burn down. She nodded. Tonight, worse things already happened. Tonight, the house is on fire. You can either help carry people out, or you can decide that the shape of the house matters more. She handed him one of the duplicated papers. Be useful. He looked at it. He looked at the boy. He looked at the bishop. Then he folded the paper and put it into his windbreaker pocket with the tiny awkwardness of someone teaching his hands a new habit. I'll take that, he said, to no one and to everyone, and he meant the responsibility, not the evidence. It surprised him as much as it surprised her. Sirens sounded then, the local kind, not the national. Someone had done what people do when they see a light on in a place that should be dark. They had called someone with a uniform. The blue windbreaker men looked relieved. They would get to deliver a scene to the police that could be explained with alarm codes and trespassing and concerned bystanders. Bishop Renard exhaled an elegant sigh. This is no longer pastoral, he said. Sister Agatha gathered the last of the copies into a stack that trembled like an old saint's hands and thrust them at John. Run, she told him. He looked at her as if she had asked him to do something impossible. Where? He said. Away, she said. And toward. He nodded, the only liturgy he trusted. He ran. Miriam expected Daniel to move to block him. Instead, Daniel turned to the windbreaker men and said something soft and precise. They stepped backward, creating a gap that wasn't there a second ago. John slipped through and vanished into the school's intestine of corridors. It was, Miriam realized, the only miracle she'd ever seen that had been performed by a committee. A momentary agreement to pretend doors were walls and walls were doors. The police arrived with all the authority of men who know that uniforms are costumes and costumes require good posture. There were questions. There were IDs. There were statements about old records and the inconvenience of nostalgia. Bishop Renard played his role as concerned custodian with such delicacy that Miriam almost forgave him his cruelty. Daniel spoke like a man who had found his spine in a file cabinet. Sister Agatha told the truth in a way that made it feel like gossip. Miriam said as little as possible and let her eyes be honest. In the end, nothing was resolved, which meant everything had begun. She did not go back to the convent. She went instead to the small apartment above the bakery, whose owner had once confessed to stealing flour from himself. She locked the door and sat on the floor with the canvas bag and the folder and the photograph of the boy who had become a priest with a secret sewn into his hand. She turned the photograph over, traced the handwriting, and let the 3 words, "Our vow holds," be more dangerous than any key. She knew what it meant now. It did not mean marriage. It did not even mean romance. It meant that 2 young people had made a promise to keep a child, someone else's perhaps, no one's perhaps, from becoming a statistic. It meant that when the board called it curation, he had called it theft and done it anyway. Somewhere in the city, a person of a certain age carried a scar shaped like a new name. Somewhere in the gym's ceiling, dust settled on moral calculus. The next morning, the newspapers printed a respectable version. Unauthorized entry at former school raises questions about records. There were quotes from civic-minded people and a photograph of Bishop Renard, looking like a man who had reluctantly accepted a complicated apology. There was no mention of a hand. There was no mention of a key. There was a mention of Mr. Daniel, a member of a compliance task force that made him sound like a spreadsheet with legs. Sister Miriam did not appear in print. She appeared instead on 3 phones she had never seen before, her image captured from a distance by cameras that had learned to be eyes. In one, she was holding the gauze-wrapped hand. The caption read, "Relic or evidence." The world did what it always did. It made jokes, it took sides. It forgot on schedule. But forgetting was not an option on the lower docks, where John had become a courier of a different sort, running manila envelopes to lawyers whose names were never spelled the same way twice, to reporters who were tired of publishing apologies, to priests who had always been better at funerals than baptisms. Sister Agatha trained 3 old nuns to work a copier like a loom. Daniel resigned and submitted a report that would be redacted into unrecognizability and then somehow leak anyway. Bishop Renard hosted a press conference beside a fountain and talked about learning, listening, and standards, words that had been bleached so often they were mostly fiber. The city shrugged and sharpened its appetite for the next outrage. And Miriam, who had lived long enough to know that outrages age like bread, kept going. She buried the hand at dusk in a corner of the convent garden where the hydrangeas scolded the lilacs for being sentimental. She did not tell anyone where. She sprinkled the salt Osana had given her into the earth, not because she believed in rituals, but because rituals are how we talk to time. She said a prayer for Father Luca that sounded like an argument. She said a prayer for the child whose name was now a fact. She said a prayer for herself, not for forgiveness, but for stamina. When she stood up, knees popping like ancient wood, she felt older in the useful way, the way a tree feels old, not a statue. A week later, the envelope with the photograph returned to her in an unmarked package, as if the city itself had chosen to be poor but generous. There was a single note inside, printed by a machine that had eaten irony for breakfast. Our vow held. Thank you. No signature, no address, just the fact of survival typed in a font used for invoices. Miriam held it over the sink as if it might catch fire. Then she put it with the few things she considered absolutely real. A shard of blue glass from a window shattered the night she'd chosen her vocation. A coin pressed into her hand by a woman who had nothing to give but insisted. The photograph of a younger priest before he had decided to become complicated. Bishop Renard called her in for a conversation that was part theater, part chess. "You have embarrassed us," he said, and the us was a cathedral built out of pronouns. "Only the parts of you that deserved embarrassment," she said, and they both smiled to acknowledge the remark for what it was, hazardous but not lethal. He offered her a position on a committee with a name as long as a rosary. She declined and suggested a broom instead. He assured her the church was responding responsibly. She asked whether the response would survive after the cameras moved on. He said God prospers in quiet. She said so does rot. In the end, he blessed her with 2 fingers and a suspicious heart. She blessed him back with a glance that suggested she might not call him Your Excellency next time. On Sunday, she stood at the back of the church and watched as the faithful performed the choreography of hope in a building designed to make hope look tall. An old man coughed like a motor trying to believe in itself. A child tugged his mother's sleeve at the worst possible time and was forgiven at the best. The choir sang a hymn about mercy that had survived 3 translations and 1 civil war. Miriam listened and remembered the rule she had made for herself when she first took vows: never allow the ideal to excuse the actual. The church was an ideal. The church was also a room full of actual people, some of whom would always be tempted to curate the inconvenient out of existence and call it love. She could not fix it. She could only refuse to let it pretend. After Mass in the side courtyard where the statue of the patron saint had lost 2 fingers to frost and 1 to mischief, a young woman waited. She had a face that would not admit its own beauty, and hands that would not stop moving, folding themselves, unfolding, folding again. "Sister," she said, with the careful respect of someone speaking to a person who had recently been a headline. "I'm late." Miriam smiled without showing her teeth. "I am always late," she said. The woman shook her head. "No, I mean I'm late, and I don't know whether to be terrified or grateful." She touched her abdomen lightly, as if tapping a secret. "Someone told me you knew a man once who believed in vows. I thought maybe you would know what to do with a vow that grew." Miriam's heart did the thing hearts do when truth appears, wearing a disguise so thin even children can see through it. "I know what to do with a vow," she said. "We keep it. We break it. We repair it. We inherit it. We forgive it. We turn it into a life." The woman nodded, relief and fear arguing in her eyes. "I don't want anyone to curate my baby," she whispered. Miriam almost laughed, and it would have been a kind laugh, the only kind that matters. "No one will," she said, and she meant it with a ferocity that would not look good on a saint card. "Not while I have salt, and not while I have hands." That night, Sister Miriam wrote a letter to Father Luca and burned it unread. It was not for him. It was for the part of herself that had needed him to be something other than a liar with good intentions. She scattered the ashes in the same corner of the garden where his hand slept separately from his name. The hydrangeas looked like clocks that had chosen color over accuracy. The sky was the sort of blue you find only in paintings of heaven and certain kinds of bruises. She stayed until the mosquitoes convinced her she was not the protagonist of the evening. Then she went inside. In the months that followed, the city learned new words for anger and new shortcuts to forgetfulness. Names surfaced and sank. The program called Glass became a morality tale, told by people who had been children when it was in fashion, and by people who had always preferred morality tales to moral labor. There were lawsuits and settlements and scholarships and memorial bricks that allowed the living to step on the names of the dead in a way someone called noble. Sister Agatha died, as old men and old women do when their work is done and their jokes are spent. At her funeral, 3 children whose names had been aliases stood in the back and did not cry. Daniel married badly, and then well and taught a class at a community college on ethics and administration that made students laugh in ways that hurt. Bishop Renard was promoted. He gave a speech about transparency beside a glass window that had been cleaned 3 times that morning and was dirty by noon. John started a small nonprofit with a large name and learned that very little can be done with very little except the right things. And Sister Miriam, she grew quieter in conversation and louder in interruption. She refused to let any meeting use the phrase best practices without looking for the worst ones. She visited the girl with the moving hands and held the baby who arrived with a shock of hair like a truth that would not stay down. She kept the photograph of the younger priest and the faceless girl in a drawer with the salt tin and the tiny capsule that had birthed a paper trail. She slept irregularly and without regret. She did not become a hero. She became something less interesting and more important. A woman who had done one impossible thing in a world that offers a buffet of them and had not, after mistaken herself for the menu. Sometimes, alone in the garden, she would look at her hands and imagine them cut away from her, sleeping in the soil with other unfinished parts of good intentions. She reminded herself that the point had never been the hand. The point had been the willingness to be ugly on behalf of something that could become beautiful. The scandal was not the cutting. The scandal was what we are willing to hide in order to keep our self-portrait flattering. She wondered how many more envelopes remained in lockers, in drawers, in hearts. She wondered whether the next person to ask for help would use the voice of a liar telling the truth or of an honest man telling a lie. She wondered, and then, as always, she acted, because wondering was a luxury and action was a tithe. One evening, as autumn rehearsed its throat-clearing coughs and the city's evenings turned to glass, a letter arrived without a return address. Inside, a photocopy of the photograph she had saved, the faces bleached into impression. Across it, one line typed in the staccato confession of an old machine. Our vow held because yours did. No signature. No seal. No proof beyond the gooseflesh that rose on her forearms like a congregation standing. She placed the letter in the drawer with the others and closed it, not like someone guarding a secret, but like someone saving a recipe that had finally worked. The story traveled, as stories do, and by the time it reached the edge of the next parish, it had sprouted inaccuracies like buds. Some said the hand had glowed. Some said the lockers had contained gold. Some said the bishop had wept. Some said Sister Miriam had been excommunicated. None of those things were true. The truth was both more ordinary and more miraculous. A dying priest had asked for something indecent and holy. A nun had obeyed not the letter of the law, but its marrow. Men in blue jackets had remembered that their hands were for more than pockets. And a child had run at the exact right speed toward and away from the same door. A school had been turned from a mausoleum back into a rumor. A vow had refused to die. Years later, when her knees were speeches and her hands were maps, Sister Miriam visited the grave whose headstone bore no hand. She brought flowers, not because he deserved them, but because the living do. She spoke out loud because the dead do not care how ridiculous the living look, and the living do. You were right, she said. It had to be separate. She placed her palms together and felt for a moment the phantom weight of the gauze. You were wrong, she added, not unkindly. You thought it would save only one life. The wind replied in the way wind replies, by being a reminder that the world moves without needing reasons. She left the flowers. She left no note. She left as she had arrived, carrying nothing anyone could catalog and everything that mattered. What shocked everyone, in the end, wasn't the hand or the key or the locker doors opening like a row of startled mouths. It was that a nun had refused to be managed. A priest had chosen accuracy over innocence. A bureaucrat had remembered usefulness. A bishop had been outmaneuvered by paper. And a boy had outrun a story that wanted to keep him small. The shock wore off, as shock does. The consequences didn't. The church kept being a hospital for liars, and sometimes, on Tuesdays at midnight, by the docks, it also became a place where vows could be repaired in rooms that smelled like dust and mercy. And when people asked Sister Miriam, with that blend of accusation and admiration reserved for those who interfere with the choreography of respectable sin, why she had done it, she did not give them doctrine. She gave them the only thing that had ever made sense to her, an answer that was unremarkable and therefore adequate. Because he asked, she said, because I knew how. Because someone else couldn't. Because I am not interested in clean. Then she would smile the small, fierce smile of a woman who has learned that holiness is never a white dress. It is salt on a wound. It is a copy machine wheezing truth. It is a grave missing a hand, and a garden that forgives everything planted in it so long as it is finally honest.